Welcome to our pre-launch gathering for Two Pieces of Cloth, One Family's Story of the Holocaust. We have an incredible opportunity here. We're going to sit with author Joe Gold, who has written this beautiful memoir told through his parents' voices of their story surviving the Holocaust. And we're going to have that conversation with Dr. Robert Krell, who actually interviewed Joe's father when in the 1980s, which helped form the basis of the story. And I feel like that's a great place to start with our conversation today. Joe, tell us a little bit about how you began the journey of this book and where the initial pieces came to tell this story of the two pieces of cloth.
Sure. Thanks for starting us off, Shai. The inspiration for the writing of this book came from my children. They had been after me for years, asking me to put something down in writing with regards to their Saba and Savta's story. And it's something that I decided that I really wanted to do for my grandchildren, so that they would have something that would tell their story. And when I was in synagogue in 2019, Yom Kippur service, during the Yizkor service, there was a poem. It was called Backwards and Forwards, written by Rabbi Schulweis, that got me thinking about getting started. And right after Yom Kippur, with that poem in mind, I began putting pen to paper to write the story. Now, there was, as you had mentioned, there was this interview that Dr. Krell, Robert Krell, did with my dad in 1984 that I started to listen to. And I listened to it several times and said, this is amazing, because this is an outline. This is an outline that I can use to write the book. And that's where I began.
Well, it's amazing that your book and the outline came from this testimony. Dr. Krell, you captured testimony, you captured this story. What is the value that you see beyond Joe being able to tell his parents' story, but this endeavor you did 40 years ago to capture testimony? How is that serving the world beyond the microcosm of the people who want to engage with this book and Joe?
Well, I cannot tell you how excited I am with Joe's project and the product, the fact that this memoir now exists. Because back then I had the idea in the late 70s that the Holocaust survivors' stories needed to be captured. They're absolutely too important to lose. And I actually made my first audiovisual testimonies of some survivors who lived in Vancouver in 1978 and 79. I don't know how early that was in the grander scheme of things, but certainly Spielberg was a little later than that. With a lot more,
I was only born in 79,
to do it.
And I was only born in 79. So
okay, I began to make it, and it felt like proof to me of its worth. As a psychiatrist, which I am, and as a child Holocaust survivor myself, I had the strong feeling that if we captured these stories, survivors would live with less mental anguish. If their stories were out on tape, they would not be screening in their minds all the time. Secondly, of course, there's a historical dimension. One would capture certain really important pieces of history to be confirmed by others, because in those chaotic times there were no clocks, no watches, no way of noting everything particularly, but the survivors presented the best they could their authentic experiences, and that was precious. And then, of course, I thought in terms of Holocaust education, that for the future, someday we would all grow older and not be able to tell our stories. At that time, actually, there was not that much public testimony offered to high schools. We started those programs as well. But now we're sitting on a treasure trove of audiovisual testimony that we can use into the future. And I had one other side issue that I'd like to tell you about that is very relevant to Joe's experience. Survivors wanted to protect their children from these stories. They were simply too horrific, too traumatic, so filled with loss and anguish that they could not really tell their children or decide exactly when to tell their children, because one of them would break into tears and the conversation would be finished. And I thought that if I was able to make a reasonable attempt to capture this story that requires days and nights of telling, but within 2 hours, that a video could be watched by a parent and a child without interruption. That is, even if they broke down in tears, even over their sad moments, they could continue to listen. And so therefore we made the tapes and we offered them to the children. Not all accepted them. Some I know accepted those tapes to have in their homes and have never watched them. And so anytime one of these finds its way into the hands of a second generation, I'm very excited. They serve the purpose, after all. My hopes and predictions.
Absolutely, this work is doing incredible work for the families, but I think also for the broader community and the world. This collective memory, the concept of never again, is so deeply rooted in the testimony. Joe, when you were reviewing this testimony of your father and embodying the voice of your parents, how did you translate this testimony into then speaking for your parents? What was that process like?
Well, I must tell you that I had very mixed emotions during the process, which involved about 4 to 5 months of gathering the materials, listening to the tape over and over again, going through my files. I also had a treasure trove of documentation, letters. I always knew that my father wanted to write a book. And as a matter of fact, I did very recently find 3 pages that my father did write. And I believe that he wrote those pages shortly after doing the interview with Dr. Krell. And so
I'd feel very comfortable if you called me Robert throughout this.
Okay, Robert.
Or, you know,
I've always called you Rob.
Old friends, Robbie.
So you know, knowing that my dad always did want to write his story, listening to the tape, listening to his words and his voice, and remembering things that he would talk to me about, and remembering some of the things my mother talked about, really made it something that I wanted to do. So hearing the voice even made it more pronounced.
And Dr. Krell, Joe mentioned his feelings of sadness. Children who are going to experience the words or the experience of their parents again, how should they address it? How should they cope it? How can they infuse this in their lives, but also move forward?
You know, you do not enter this arena of thinking without an expectation that there are places where you will be depressed, sad, suffer for your parents once again, as so many sons and daughters of survivors did. But there is another there's another truth to all of this. When I began to interview, doing the audiovisual testimony project, and we expanded it to ultimately doing some 120 testimonies, I would get calls from colleagues back east who I tried to inspire to do the same, create the documentation programs. And we did a national one in Canada as well. And they would say, what kinds of mental health professionals should we have on tap, and who should be doing the interviews? And that was strictly because I was coincidentally a psychiatrist. And I said to them, I said, if you want a psychiatrist or mental health professional on hand, that will be very important for the interviewer.
For the
Not
interviewer.
For the interviewee. These people, they are strong, determined, resilient individuals. Look at David Gold's accomplishments. After all that he endured, raised a decent family, community-minded, a business that was the envy, I think, of Vancouver business people. These are strong individuals. And may I also add that the reason that some survivors who wished to write a book did not have proper guidance and tried to write in English, for example, which was often their fourth, fifth, or seventh language, they could not find the words in English, and they were mostly at that time being interviewed in English, which is very, very unfair. But we did the best we could, and I think Mr. Gold did the best he could to provide his account. Never during that time was I worried for one moment for his emotional well-being, because I assumed that any survivor who offers this story will have a few days of depression and preoccupation. And I always invited them to give me a call if they wish, so we could talk some more. And then after that, felt strengthened by having left the testimony for their children, because that was their ultimate objective in the first instance. And so I think Joe will be strengthened by this process. If anything, if he's going to feel anything emotionally depressing, it will be counterbalanced and exceeded by the fact of the success of this memoir. He's left something precious.
When you think about this book, what do you want to see come out of this book and the conversation around it?
Definitely, I think that the book can be used for educational purposes, to teach future generations about the Holocaust, as you said, Shai, so we don't forget. And it's really telling the story of two individuals who lived. They had nice lives in Eastern Europe, and they had families. They had multiple uncles and aunts and cousins, and they got together for dinners and for Shabbat and for holidays, and they led a good life. And to see what happened to them, it's amazing. It's amazing that they were able to come through this and live the lives that they did. So the resilience and the strength is remarkable. Personally, I want to see where this goes with regards to finding out more information about my parents' families. I'm discovering things monthly. Ever since the book has been written, I've been getting things that I never thought I would get. I've gotten photos, I've gotten pictures of both my grandparents, my maternal and my paternal grandparents, just very recently. They're not in the book, but they'll be on the website, because the website that's being created has historical documentation that will give work together with the book, and I'm basically continuing to write the story as information comes in, and I expect more information to come in. And for me, that is amazing.
So we started off talking about this interview, and now you're talking about the continuing story. I want to ask a hypothetical, a fantastical question for a moment. You've now watched Robert's interview of your father many times. If you could teleport back in time to that conversation and be given the opportunity to ask a question in that interview, in an audience question, or add one more question to that conversation, what would you ask your father?
I would ask my father what he did with the book that I found when I was 5 years old in a bolt of fabric in his stockroom. And I never did ask that question. It is the bookend to both the beginning and the end of the story that I wrote, and I never did ask that question. I do remember the day that Rob came and picked my father up and took him somewhere to do this interview with him, because my dad and I shared office space, and Robert very kindly picked him up, brought him back, and then my dad looked at me and he said, "Ooh, there were some other things that I wanted to talk about that I never had a chance to. I just remembered." So I said, "Don't worry, I'll bring the camera and the tripod, and you can sit at your desk and you can talk about things to your heart's content." And he actually did talk for another 2 hours. So it went on. And I think it was the greatest thing for my father to be able to have that conversation. And it led to a lot of other conversations.
Well, Joe and Robert, I want to thank you so much for having this conversation and for the incredible work you've both done to keep this memory not only alive, but as Robert said, strengthening the next generations. And may you both go from strength to strength going forward. And Joe, congratulations on the publication of Two Pieces of Cloth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shai. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.